Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here and welcome to another episode of Jin'talks. Today I'm going to be continuing to look at the Blue Donut War, though I will warn viewers who are watching this in real time that this video is slightly delayed due to the fact that I've had some exams this week and also Evesterdam have taken up a significant amount of my time where I would normally make this video. And as such, I'm going to run from my old research and not include the stuff that's happened in the past 6 days. And that's so that I can spend the proper time analysing and researching what happened and figuring out what it all means in the grander scale of things. I know that's not what a lot of you are hoping for, but I really wanted just to set your expectations now. And I also think that the events that I've researched here are very interesting and very key to how the war has developed. So with that said, let's take a look up at Paragon Falls, the region which has been the front lines between the Guardians of the Galaxy Coalition and the Drone Region Federation, with another fight breaking out in MTO, where Guardians of the Galaxy had been attempting to raise a beachhead from which they could project their power across the rest of Paragon Falls. This is something that had started with the absolutely apocalyptically huge fight in MTO we saw last episode, but in this fight the Guardians of the Galaxy committed significantly less, just throwing down a Fortas to spark this engagement. Still, a Fortas presents almost as much threat as a Keepstar to the defending forces, given the ability of it to hold capitals. And as such, the combined DRF-aligned forces brought 1,157 players to bear in the engagement. As such, the attacking forces, primarily Guardians of the Galaxy members alongside Pandemic Legion, were going to be somewhat outnumbered. However, they made the decision to use the same ace in the hole that they had shown previously, their Super Capital fleet, this time bolstered by the usage of Pandemic Legion's Super Capitals in support of their own. Seeing Pandemic Legion using their Super Capitals in this way is something that's very interesting from a political standpoint, as previously they've been somewhat friendly with the DRF. However, this seems to not be a truly political action, but potentially a mercenary contract from the Guardians of the Galaxy in order to bolster their numbers for this engagement, as the DRF don't seem to be taking any political exception to the usage of Pandemic Legion in this manner. However, only time will tell if any grudges are formed or any deals are truly broken by this usage of power from Pandemic Legion. And of course, it will be important to try and track if this is a continued pattern of behaviour from PanFam or if it's merely just a one-time occurrence, as that could indicate the PanFam's stance on this war in general. The final tally comes out as roughly 172 billion lost by the defenders of this onlining Fortas, and 115 lost by those trying to kill it. And this is despite the aforementioned usage of a Guardians of the Galaxy superfleet in order to dominate the grid as much as possible, and that's because that this superfleet isn't particularly great at defending your own sub-capitals, which led to the death of 158 Macarials, trading off poorly against opposing Abaddon and Macarial fleets during the latter half of the fight. Still, despite being down in ISK, Guardians of the Galaxy were able to secure their strategic objective in this fight, getting that Fortas online and letting them project their power now throughout the entirety of Paragon Falls. Moving over to the south, and more specifically to Innsmother, I wanted to take a look at one of the smaller fights that have been going on, kind of throughout this war that I haven't really talked very much about because they're kind of hard to get grips on. But this kind of day-to-day fighting will generally tell you a lot about the flow of the war, so I thought I'd take a minute here and just, break one down and show what happened. It seems the fight was over a final timer for a Fortas that was held by the ex-Vanguard Coalition member Stellar Nova, which Triumvirate are still relatively friendly with, unlike the other members of the South. This Fortas had been reinforced by hostile forces, and the final timer was being fought between various mercenary groups hired by the DRF, specifically Skill Yourself, Pandemic Horde, and Mercenary Coalition, fighting against the defending forces of Triumvirate and Stellar Nova. As both sides in the fight had imperfect knowledge about what the other had in terms of capitals, neither side decided to escalate the fight beyond a couple of force auxiliaries, and as such, it was a primarily sub-cap based engagement. Given this, it became a very familiar sight to most FCs in the game right now, with two Macario fleets simply dueling for control over a grid as they tried to kill a structure. And unsurprisingly, given their significantly larger number, the mercenaries here were able to come on top, killing the Fortas and a large quantity of hostile ships, but not without losing their own. Even this fight, however, which involves, 300 people, is in a weird time zone, and is just over a single structure that isn't of a great importance strategically, isn't the low end of the kind of combat that we're seeing in this war, however. In fact, I've had several people come and talk to me about the power of Pandemic Legion and Triumvirate in small gangs, using them to present gate camps that are very hard for FCON and Phoenix Federation to disrupt, that are making their line members' lives incredibly difficult, effectively attacking the player base and not the strategic objectives, which are very difficult for Pandemic Legion and Triumvirate to take whilst they are so hopelessly outgunned in super capitals, given the power of Legacy's super capital fleet in the area. With this kind of example of the lower end skirmishing in the south covered, let's do something that I've been looking for an excuse to do for a while now, and take a look at my home region of Providence, which has been effectively under siege by Pandemic Legion for a significant period of time, with the intent of whittling down morale and numbers in fleets in preparation for a larger scale invasion after the station changes come into effect. As such, one of the focuses for this conflict has been 3D TAC, the capital staging system of Proviblock, which had had an Astra House placed in it a couple of times, after two previous attempts to anchor an Astra House had failed amongst the wrecks of many Proviblock ships attempting to defend against this PL encroachment. Following this, several attempts were made by Proviblock, and specifically myself, to remove it from the region, as obviously it hampered our ability to use capitals and not have Pandemic Legion be able to bubble them immediately or generally interfere with us. Which PL would respond to with a typical Macario fleet and a supporting fleet of dreadnoughts and a few carriers and force auxiliaries to support them, which is something that Providence struggles to counter due to their low capital numbers. As such, when I put down a Reitaru in 3D TAC in order to start a potential fight in the weekend, Pandemic Legion responded in much the same way as they typically would, bringing a fleet from their current staging in Hay Hill to 3D TAC using a couple of bridges. Proviblock then moved from their main sub-capital staging in FTAC-Y into the system, sitting on the Fortas in the area with a small group of dreads that they were intending to use for this engagement, which numbered around 30. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, the fight was on for Pandemic Legion, as Proviblock walked both their capitals and their sub-capital fleet in, despite having a numbers disadvantage in the capital race, and a minor but not insignificant advantage in subcaps. But still, nothing that would probably turn the tide of a capital fight, especially seeing as these were artillery abaddons, which have notoriously bad DPS, and as such are very ineffective against capitals, even if a sub-capital fight against Macarios can be won. But as tests spiked into local in F9E, preparing to jump themselves to DTAC G, the true plan became clear. This had all been bait for Pandemic Legion. And all CVA needed to do was keep their capitals alive for as long as they possibly could, and keep the Pandemic Legion fleet held down with bubbles. And that aspect of keeping their dreads alive so that they could provide insinos for test when the fight actually came was proving to be more difficult than anticipated, with Provi losing roughly 2 dreads for every 1 in Pandemic Legion they killed. But despite it being touch and go for the 7 minutes that they needed to wait for fatigue, the cavalry arrived as it always should do in a great tale, in just a nick of time, with Test's capital fleet arriving on the last possible sino that had been prepared, and wiping out almost every single capital that Pandemic Legion had committed to the field, leading to 195 billion being destroyed on the Pandemic Legion side, whereas only 90 billion was destroyed on the Proviblock and Test side. And this fight really serves to show just how powerful Test has become in terms of a capital power in the south. Bringing 150 capitals with simply a rage ping is a huge asset for Test to have, and one they can potentially use to really swing their dick around, especially in large timers. And it'll be interesting to see how much they are willing and able to leverage that in their existing war against Triumvirate and of course Pandemic Legion. Moving back up north, however, I wanted to highlight another fight between the DRF and the Guardians of the Galaxy Coalition, this time in 8-3 TAC, which is in what I personally consider to be the most unpronounceable of all the region names. Owasa, Osa, I'm not sure. Please correct me in the comments. The fight itself was sparked by the final timer of a Soitoyo in the system, which are obviously huge targets in these sorts of wars, as they represent a large amount of industrial capability on the part of the defending alliance. And it has been inferred that this one specifically was targeted due to the impact that it was having on the manufacturing index, and the attempts to use this to understand where things were being built within the Drone Region Federation, so that they could counteract any massive dreadnought build-up within the area. In fact, I was given a rough estimation of around 100 dreads being built in the facility at the time by Sword Dragon. However, the veracity of this cannot be verified with the other party, as they wished not to comment on what was possibly lost within the Soitoyo. As such, I'm just going to assume that they said it was only parts, just to fill the old meme. The fight involved much the same as what we saw in MTO for the attacking forces, with Darkness and the rest of the Guardians of the Galaxy Coalition bringing a large supercapital fleet into the area in order to outweigh their numbers' disadvantage when compared with the defending forces. Bringing just under 100 supercapitals to bear, one of which actually happened to be the very expensive Vendetta-class supercarrier. The fight itself was rather bloody, with around 400 billion being destroyed between both sides, although the DRF-aligned forces took the worst of it, with 250 billion-isk of their own assets being destroyed, to only 150 billion on the opposing side, though this total does not include the Soitoyo, which for some reason isn't being picked up by the BR tool, and is worth an additional 80 million-isk. A large amount of this cost comes from an incredibly ill-advised attempt at dread-bombing the superfleet with only 70 dreadnoughts, which had little impact apart from killing a handful of force auxiliaries. Another interesting tactic that we saw in this fight, however, was Test finally bringing to bear their experimental Daredevil-based defanging fleet, which is specifically designed to allow them to combat super carriers, which lose a lot of their effectiveness after their fighter bombers are destroyed. 44 of them were fielded for the fleet, and between them they managed to kill 23 support fighters, 94 heavy fighters, and 263 light fighters. The DRF also brought a large quantity of space superiority-filled carriers in order to assist this kind of defanging tactic. However, judging by reports from people who were actually there, it seems one of the main failures of this fight was to provide enough replacement space superiority fighters for these carriers to allow them to continue their defanging throughout the fight. And they believe that with more space superiority fighters, they will be able to effectively neutralize all supercarriers fielded by the Guardians of the Galaxy, which would be incredibly worrying for them going forwards. And I'm going to be especially interested in seeing what the Guardians of the Galaxy Coalition instates as a counter to this in the future. It may be that the dream that Apothony once talked to me about, of having a StarCraft-like micro-duel between multiple fleets of space superiority carriers becoming the meta, might yet become true. Moving on from this very interesting fight in the north, I want to take a look back at the south, and specifically to Catch again, for not a fight this time, but more of a conclusion to a storyline we touched on last week, where we explored the BTAC X Fortas, how it had come into the hands of PL, and, why it was under attack. And it finally fell on the 25th of October, with Legacy and other attacking forces managing to put around 1,000 in local. However, Pandemic Legion and the Unnamed Coalition declined to take the engagement, as there was simply too much there for them to reasonably fight and expect to win against. And that's the last major military action that I want to cover in this episode. However, as we all know, military actions are not the only things that are important during a war of this scale. In fact, they're probably less important than what I'm about to cover, which is the political aspect of the war. However, unlike with military actions, the political aspects of the war are pretty much impossible to nail down and have concrete evidence for, as even logs can be faked. As such, I'm going to try and mention my sources here, or at least the side where my sources come from, in order to be fair and transparent with my reporting here. The first of these major political movements that I heard about was Sword Dragon's rumoured 5 trillion-ish ultimatum that he made to the DRF to stop the war. This is something that Sword Dragon declined to comment on, but was pushed rather heavily by the DRF-aligned sources that I'm in contact with, wherein they specifically stated that they didn't accept this and that the DRF, would never surrender and all that sort of thing, really trying to bring out that machismo, very Russian culture from their coalition, which could indicate that it's simply an attempt at propaganda. However, it does really raise an interesting question, and that's what does Sword Dragon really intend to do if he wins this war? What are his goals, and what are his gains, potentially, from this war? As it's very unlikely that he will be able to hold the entirety of DRF territory with his current coalition. And whilst the space currently being attacked may make for great renting grounds in the future, if they are adjacent to a hostile entity, they're going to present a lot of problems for the potential renters who would like to set up shop there, reducing the potential worth of this area. It could alternatively have been some way of basically hedging for the moon changes. So if the North lost a significant amount of its moons and DRF space gained a significant amount of moons, then this would give the GOTG the necessary economic justification to move some more of their power towards the southeast while staying close to their allies in the Pan-Fam. However, if that was the case, I can't help but think that GOTG would have waited until after the moon changes to start making these aggressive moons, just in case the North remained as lucrative as it was before. Another, and in my opinion more likely candidate reason for why this war was started is actually the large amount of CO2 corpse that GOTG absorbed after Judgment Day. As these corps will contain new FCs and new pilots who will need to be integrated into the GOT war machine, and having a large-scale war is a great way to do that. Especially if there isn't a huge amount of wealth on the line for it, and it's not a fight for survival. And if that is the case, then a 5 trillion ultimatum would actually make quite a lot of sense from Sword Dragon's position, as that would allow him to pay for all his losses and have a significant share of wealth to then show, how good they are at war and really build upon that as a propaganda tool within his own coalition. Still, the motivation for this war is something we might never know, so feel free to speculate on what caused this war in the comments below. I'd be very interested to hear what, Guardians of the Galaxy members' theories might be, as you probably know the man better than I do. Another interesting nuance of this war so far has been the fact that Pandemic Legion and Pandemic Horde have been active in fighting on opposite sides of the conflict, especially in the Southern Theatre, where Pandemic Horde has been hired by the Drone Region Federation, and Pandemic Legion has been working alongside the Triumvirate and the Unnamed Coalition. From what I understand, both sides have kept each other blue and simply do not shoot each other in these engagements, but it will be interesting to see what happens if, say, Pandemic Horde and Pandemic Legion are the last two fleets on a grid and they're fighting over an objective, although that is a situation that's very unlikely to occur. Simply because it makes us question whether Pandemic Horde values their contract more than they value their relationship with Pandemic Legion. It should also be noted that Pandemic Horde isn't the only mercenary alliance that the DRF have hired, with them also taking on board Mercenary Coalition and Skill Yourself, both of which are being used to effectively stabilise the Southern Theatre, in the absence of the DRF being able to involve themselves directly as much as they would like, as their attention has been ripped away by the conflict in the North. Another fun political event that was sparked by the 3D tag fight between Pandemic Legion and Providence was that it was broadcast live on the Meta Show, and as such a large amount of FCs were present, which gave them a great deal of time to argue in the aftermath of all of it about what this war in the South was about, who would win, what it was for, and it was a really interesting discussion in general, and I absolutely recommend that people who are interested in getting deeper in this war go and give it a listen. But the most interesting part of this for me came when Ghast and Pro-God Legend talked to each other about what the future of the South might be, with Ghast stating that Tri would live in curse and harass the previously held territories, as they didn't think that there was an entity that could be installed that could challenge them permanently for control of that area, especially given that FCON was effectively still losing to them from their perspective. By contrast, Pro-God Legend stated they simply intended to rent out the area and make enough money that it would be worth them defending it. Ghast later clarified to me personally that this was meant as a thought exercise and not a concrete plan for what might happen after a Legacy and DRF victory, and more of an attempt to attack FCON as what he perceived to be a weak alliance that couldn't stand up to their own power. Whilst all this was going on, we also started to see the Imperium turn up to a couple of these major fights, most notably in Cerberus's in both of the MTO fights. However, the Imperium as a whole remains neutral in this conflict and is simply using it as a way to keep their PvP players engaged and active. The Northern Theatre has also slowed down, with a significant amount of time being taken up as the attacking forces of the Guardians of the Galaxy attempt to reinforce large numbers of citadels in the area in order to progress their strategic movement forwards and deeper into Paragon Falls, which can only be done after you remove the capital umbrella in your way, which is something that we saw in the south previously. As such, we can expect things to cool down and just, have basically a week-long break whilst people wait for those massive 5-day final Fortizar timers to tick over before the conflict really reignites up there. The major targets for both sides seem to be a mixture of Soitoyos, which are building large amounts of capitals, and staging Fortizars and even Keepstars, as disrupting either of these will greatly impact your opponent's war effort. By contrast, the more day-to-day grind of Aegis Sov is significantly less important, simply because sovereignty doesn't impact your ability to hold a citadel in a system, which has now become de facto military control over that system. In addition, citadels seem to remain the only place where a single point concentration of force is required, which tends to be the thing that drives large-scale battles that we can actively see and report on, as opposed to interceptor-based skirmishes. And speaking of Aegis Sov, Tri has implemented a very interesting strategy that they've decided to call Elastic Defense, kind of reminiscent of the Hindenburg Line in World War I, if you're familiar with it. What they are effectively doing is only fighting for major objectives and only then when they think they can win, and then after their opponents have taken certain objectives that they deem to be important, such as TCU or iHub control, they then simply counterattack and force the opponents to defend on a larger front, with themselves having the better logistical position to put pressure on these points. However, this tactic is not without its disadvantages, and in fact we've seen this slow hollowing out of the iHubs that triumvirate control within their own territory, as shown by this spreadsheet, which is accurate to the 26th of October 2017. This is something that will eventually start to concern Triumvirate, given that iHubs are the most important of all of the Aegis Sov structures, as they control ADMs and your ability to put in strategic upgrades such as sinusoidal jammers. However, right now they remain in control of the iHubs of most of their major staging systems and tactical choke points. And with that, we have covered all of the major events in the Blue Donut War that I was able to record pre-Evesterdam. Thank you for watching, and I'm sorry this turned out to be so long. I'm not quite sure how it happened. I was just freestyle recording, and I don't know, I guess I rambled for a bit too long, so sorry about that. But anyway, fly smart and take care, and I look forward to seeing you next time for the Fall of FCON.